Right, I'm going to start with the introductions and thank yous because much like a movie, exhibitions take a large team to have happen. But I promise you that my welcome remarks will be shorter than the movie credits at the last movie that you saw. People, as you're joining, we're just going to start the introduction and thank yous. What? Okay. Sorry, I'm supposed to talk into both mics. This is new for me. So we'll move them closer. So this exhibition is the result of a collaboration between Erica Lohm, who was researching Olof Althin for her dissertation, and Trevor Brandt, who was ASHM's curator at the time. Because Althin was a Swedish immigrant to America, we at ASHM were happy to have the opportunity to tell his story to a broad audience, because truly his story is one of those immigrant stories that does follow the typical immigrant narrative in some ways, but in other ways, he was very atypical and unique. And so it's been really interesting to really delve into his life and story. We were extremely grateful to receive a Dean F. Faley grant from the Decorative Arts Trust, which really made this exhibition possible. Otherwise, it would have been too much of a reach for us to be able to bring in these collections from all of these places. We're also grateful to the Barbara Osher Prosuasia Foundation, who is a generous supporter of all of the exhibitions here at ASHM. This was a really difficult time, I'm sure you can imagine, to pull off such a collaborative project. It was during a pandemic. Erica and Trevor were living in different cities, and they were also going through exciting changes in their own lives in the course of working on this exhibit over the last 2 years. Erica got her PhD at the University of Delaware just last year in 2020, and then subsequently became the Peggy N. Jerry Curatorial Associate, sponsored by the Decorative Arts Trust, at the Concord Museum in Concord, Massachusetts. Taking the opposite course, Trevor left his position as curator at ASHM when he was awarded a Neubauer Family Distinguished Doctoral Fellowship to pursue his PhD at the University of Chicago. And he moved to Chicago in September of 2020. Throughout this project, I was truly awed and inspired by Erica and Trevor's passion for Althin's story and the objects that he created, and really, really amazed by their ability to juggle this project on top of their busy academic and professional lives, because for both of them, this is something that they were doing extra on top of that. I'd also like to acknowledge our design firm partners at Elusive Inc., led by Richard, whose creativity elevates every project we work with them on. ASHM team members who were key to the project were Rachel Cascadden, who took Elusive's designs and laid out all of the graphic elements in the show, and Frank Sanders and our new curator, Chris Malone, in the back, if you want to raise your hand, Chris, in case people didn't meet you, who have jumped right into working on the installation in his first few weeks on the job. I'd like to give a very special thanks to both Greg Landry and who recently retired as Winter's Director of Academic Affairs, and Kathy Gillis, the Senior Furniture Conservator at Winter, who both volunteered to come in and prepare the objects for the display on evenings and weekends, all as of volunteers. One of the really exciting things about this exhibition is how it brings together documents, photos, drawings, tools, and the furniture of Olof Althin to really look at his story and its full picture. And this would never have been possible without the generous loans by individuals and organizations of everything that is in that exhibition. And the lenders to the exhibit are the Joseph Downs Collection of the Winter Library, members of the Sundin family, who are the descendants of Olof Althin, Ned Stinson, the Milliken-Dara family, and the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. So without further ado, I'd like to turn over the mic to Trevor and Erica, who would now be happy to answer your questions. So if you're live in the audience, we'll have you raise your hand. And if you're online, you can either type your questions into the chat or you can use the raise hand function. And somehow Lauren and I guess, will go back and forth calling on people to ask their questions. All right.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Tracy, so much for your very kind introductions. And I'd just like to reiterate her thanks of both our sponsors and of the many lenders who have supported the show. It's truly been a group effort between the museum and between all these lenders and these organizations. I think, Erica, we might just speak a little bit about the origins of the show and then maybe take a couple of audience questions. And I think it would be a good place to start to say that this show, it started in a Facebook message chat.
Yeah, well, Trevor and I knew each other from both of our beginnings. I was starting my PhD program at University of Delaware, and Trevor was starting his Winterthur Fellowship, and we were both part of the Winterthur Summer Orientation month-long extravaganza. And we kept in touch. And when I was doing my dissertation research, which looked at the participation of immigrant craftspeople and consumers in the colonial revival movement, I discovered that Winterthur had a wonderful archive of account books, letters, photographs about Olof Althin's shop in Boston. And around that time, I got in touch with Trevor. This was, I think, 2019, who I knew was the curator of the Swedish Museum up here. And we just started talking, and we thought, well, wouldn't it be great if we put together an exhibition? And little did we realize how connected the story ended up being, because as we were looking for where these objects were, one of the loaners was in Wilmington. One of the great grandsons of Olof Althin was just 10 minutes away from Winterthur. So that really started things off for us.
I think this is a show where we initially thought that, oh my God, there's an incredible archive here at Winterthur. And then when we started to try to actually track down the furniture and the tools and the workbench, we realized just how much is still in the family. And that's been so much of the work of this show, is contacting the family and sort of getting them interested in the show. I think there's been a few situations in which we've actually had to just Google family members to try to find them.
Yeah,
because,
I had to abuse white pages. I got a paid membership so I could find someone.
And I think we were both telling tour groups earlier, but it's really hard to overemphasize the degree to which this archive is still there and it's still important. As of weeks ago, we were still getting emails from the family, especially the family with descendants in Texas, who have letters that neither of us have seen yet, photographs that nobody's seen before. They have a massive archive down there, and there's just so much to delve into. And being able to put on display what we have up there is such a privilege, but there's still a lot of work to do.
The trouble with writing my dissertation about colonial revival furniture is that so much of it is not in museums. This was furniture that people lived with, that they purchased new, and they became the heirlooms of tomorrow. And in most cases, this is furniture that people continue to live with, and they are beloved and treasured inheritances. And that was certainly the case for the Sundin family, who really held on to these things even as their circumstances and their lives change. I mean, imagine carting around a workbench with you all the way to Texas and not parting with it. And so hard enough to find a surviving and intact workshop to this scale. But the family story really made it special for us.
I think just the changing role of these objects throughout their time with the family too. I mean, they've gone from being writing desks to telephone desks and things stored in the basement, but brought out on special occasions to show people. I mean, they're really treasured heirlooms that have been treasured in different ways throughout time.
I'm happy to answer questions now.
Yeah, and any questions? I mean, I'm sure we can continue to spiel on our own.
Yeah.
But.
All right, we have one here. Yeah.
Well, did any of Althin's family go into the business? What happened to his workshop in Boston eventually?
Well, he retires in
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Oh, what happened? The first part was, did any of Althin's family go into business? And the second part was, what happened to his workshop? He retires in 1913, and I believe he packs up whatever remains in his shop. He sells off the big machinery, and whatever stock is left over comes with him to his house in Roxbury, which is a suburb in Boston. And from what I understand, he continued to work until he passed away in 1920, pretty unexpectedly. And from what I can gather, the family sold off some of the pieces, but kept the majority of them. And as for anyone following in his footsteps, not in the traditional sense, he only had one daughter, Bessie, but that sort of lineage is its interesting story too.
I think what we discussed in the show is that this sort of artistic legacy reverberates throughout time a little bit. The end of the show, sort of Althin's legacy, discusses his granddaughter, Adelaide Sundin, who she was raised speaking Swedish in the family, so she really carried this tradition with her, and she later in life became an artist, especially portraits of children and bas-reliefs. So sort of a different direction of artistry as Althin, so not so much in woodworking as with ceramics and painting, but she later in life really attributed her inspiration in art to Olof Althin. So I think there's that direct connection to make between them. And she herself is a really interesting figure because of her ties to this very museum that we're sitting in right now. She was an active member through her death in, I think about 2010 or so. And she actually designed our volunteer service award that we award to, our sort of best volunteer of the year every year. So she continues to have an active legacy in this museum, even as Althin is exhibited upstairs.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Do you have a question online yet, Lauren? Okay, we'll take one over here.
You said that Althin came up through the guild system. Did he have any apprentices? Did the apprentices carry on? It's sort of surprising to follow on to your question that you get to 1913 and for some reason it just falls off a cliff.
Yeah, he's sort of training during the collapse of the guild system as it's transitioning into a sort of loosely connected handicraft association, which offers him a lot more occupational mobility. So, he's brought up within the sort of traditional apprenticeship, but I don't think he's beholden to that when he gets to Boston. In fact, I think he is not, he's recruiting fellow Scandinavian woodworkers who are working in a shop. But in Boston around the same time, the North Bennett Street School offers a sort of professional track for emerging cabinet makers. So if you are a young man, even if you're a first generation, second generation American, your options are to go to North Bennett Street School, where you will receive an education in cabinet making that will equip you to work in a larger factory, where you might still do skilled work, but you may also become a skilled operator of furniture making machinery. The collapse of the traditional apprenticeship system in America meant that there were fewer and fewer people who could do the kind of work that Althin and his contemporaries did. And that was to their professional benefit, but maybe to our artistic loss.
And I think that's one of the things that's so interesting about his shop is that in a sense, he's, not quite literally, but he's recreating a feel of what the traditional apprenticeship system was. I mean, it was a small shop, maybe 6 to 10 or so workers. Individuals working on a single piece for, dozens or perhaps hundreds of hours. I mean, he himself came to America, I think at the age of 21 or 22. So he certainly wouldn't have had any apprentices while he was still in Sweden, but they're sort of playing under different yet somewhat similar rules when he comes to America in 1881.
But does that mean, follow-on question, does that mean that they were basically rendered obsolete by a technological change?
That's sort of the story of the American furniture industry, but there continued to be small pockets, and this happened on a local level in many parts of the world, where if you don't have access to the big shop, woodworkers, cabinet makers persisted on local community organizational levels, and they did teach each other. I wrote a little bit about African-American craftspeople in the South, and they actually, in an interesting way, continued this tradition of small cabinet shop work because they were excluded from the mainstream professional avenues that would have taken a young apprentice to work in a giant shop.
And I think what sort of Althin shop's niche in Boston in the early 20th century is this small but exclusive market of people who are looking for handcrafted, you know, quote unquote, American antique furniture that they specialize in.
Yeah, I mean, that it continues to be, you know, there will always be a market for the nice things that you can get made by hand. And it happened to be that in Boston at that time, the economic conditions really allowed for a small shop. Whereas in New York and Philadelphia, the sort of migration of skilled work to the Midwest, places like Grand Rapids, all but obliterated the small cabinet shop. In Boston, it's somewhat more conservative, so the local market for handmade furniture remained pretty robust.
And I think contrasting Althin's shop with other Scandinavian communities in North America is really fascinating, because you look at his small scale shop in Boston, I mentioned 6 to 10 workers. You look a little bit further west in Jamestown, New York, which was, I think, proportionally the highest, you know, Scandinavian community in on the Eastern Coast. They have immense factories creating furniture, which is completely the opposite of what Althin and his shop are doing. So, you know, whereas out west you're getting a little bit more of the mechanized production and sort of like individuals working on each step in the furniture making process.
Mass production.
Yeah, mass production, exactly. Althin's shop is really that small sort of cabinet making organization working on individual pieces for a small, very wealthy clientele.
Right, and in Boston itself, I mean, his competition, if you were to ask who his competition is obviously there are other small cabinet shops, but you also have all-purpose design firms like Davenport, which is producing incredibly high-end furniture for the same sort of elite audience, but on a very different scale. And then lower tiered, you have wholesale manufacturers producing furniture for Payne's or Jordan Marsh, who's retailing to the middle-class market. But I think there remained at the local level a sort of preference for the small shop where you could have individual attention, right? You could go to Althin and he would design the piece of furniture to your exact specifications. It would look beautiful and it would kind of have that little antique flair to it. And it would be made, you knew it was going to be made by hand. You knew exactly who the workers were.
And I think often the suggestion that it was made by the master's hand too. I mean, his account books in the Winiture archives suggest that Althin played a very small role in just about every piece of furniture that came out of the shop, whether he was just turning at the lathe or whether he was carving or actually assembling the pieces. I think he wanted his hand there somewhere so that each piece could be marketed as having been worked upon by the master craftsman in the shop.
Yeah.
Christina, perhaps.
Christina?
If I understood correctly, was that Metropolitan bought a big number of his pieces? Was there any, were they just like dominating the whole matter, or were there some smaller museums that bought his work?
The question was about the involvement of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They did not actually buy his pieces. They bought they received the collection of antiques that he helped restore. So he worked with H. Eugene Bowles, who is a great collector. And it is interesting. I will go through, for instance, pine court cupboards. I believe there's about half a dozen or so at the Met that Bowles, that are attributed to Bowles as the collector. And if you go through the account books, I found Bowles ordering restoration work on at least 6 court cupboards. So you can kind of do the math and say, well, probably most, if not all of them, went through Althin's shop before they ended up at the Met.
Yeah, I think what was bequeathed to the Met in 1909 when Bowles died was about 880 pieces of furniture, which I think really formed the core Americana collection at the Met. And it's just remarkable. I mean, when you look through the amount of restoration that Althin is doing for Bowles, I think one can confidently say that he worked on just about every piece that went into the Met in 1909. And I probably same for the MFA, though I don't know the exact number that went into the MFA when Tyler died.
I don't know that either. But yeah, this sort of relationship that developed between these collectors and the cabinet maker, it's not necessarily unique within the history of the colonial revival movement. You will find many other collectors kind of had their guy, their man Friday, essentially, to do a lot of this work. And more often than not, they were immigrants. Wallace Nutting, for example, worked with Morris Schwartz in Hartford, and Morris Schwartz, a Jewish Lithuanian immigrant. Other beautiful pieces that ended up at the Met or the Wadsworth Athenaeum from Nutting bore Schwartz's hand. So it's a sort of interesting secondary level of interpretation when you think about who beyond the dealer and the collector and the institution is touching this object.
And I don't want to speak for both of us, but I think that for us has been the most exciting part about this show is trying to find where the hands of immigrants exist within these very traditionally Americana interpreted collections at museums such as the Met or the MFA Boston.
Or Winterthur.
Or Winterthur, yeah, exactly, yeah. I mean, you wouldn't, one might not think to look for the role of an immigrant in the conservation of a piece in the early 20th century, but there he is, and he's actively creating the look and feel of American furniture for his clients based on his vision of what American furniture should look like.
Right, and I mentioned this on a tour earlier, but at one point he writes to Charles Hitchcock Tyler. He's retired. I think he's kind of bored. He says, "Can you get me a job at the Customs House? I think I would do such a better job authenticating antiques coming into the States than the guys that they have over there in Customs. Like, I've been doing this for 20 years and I see the kind of stuff that gets passed through into America, and it's bogus. And I'm so good at this. I'm so good at expertising, in his words, these pure and genuine antiques that I can be of service." And I think, like a lot of projects he started, he kind of abandoned that.
I think he was bored. This was in 1913, which is the year he retired. He also started a manuscript that year too.
Yeah,
so
didn't
I think
finish
he
it.
left his shop and then he was looking for something to do.
Right.
I had a question. So it's kind of remarkable to me how truly like antique his furniture looks, American antique. And did you get any sense in looking at the things that you found so far, did he start out right away making things in the American colonial style, or did he start out making things that seem more Swedish until he learned more about the American antiques?
Yeah.
From what I understand, Bowles shows up in his account books as early as 1886, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's making furniture. I think he's just repairing and restoring furniture. Bowles might be one of the clients he inherits from his former shop. The sense I get is that he jumps right into the artistic environment, and his strength as a cabinet maker was his versatility. I think he was stronger with carving, and so necessarily gravitated towards certain stylistic idioms, but he learns line and he learns form when he starts to create neoclassical reproductions. I think he's kind of learning on the job, but I don't think he sets out initially to make Swedish style furniture. He's setting out to make whatever is popular in Boston.
And it's really only in his home that you see this Swedish style furniture, whether it's the writing desk or this sort of like eclectic array of furniture he has, including the Griffin tilt-top tea table, you know, really sort of out there, and certainly not what his clients were buying primarily. Yeah.
I may have missed this on the tour, but what was his life like in Sweden? What age was he when he?
He was born in 1859 and immigrated in 81, which would be about what, 22 or so years old. So his apprenticeship, we don't have the exact years of his apprenticeship, but certainly the early to mid 1870s. Immigrated through Gothenburg, which was the main port of departure for Swedes coming over to North America.
He's not a cabinet maker by descent. He's born of 11 children in a farming village in southern Sweden, and goes to the nearby big city to learn in the cabinet shop there. That's a sort of an established shop. And so they kind of take him in as another son or brother, and that's sort of the same sort of familial relationship he establishes with his workers in Boston. But again, it's like he has that option when he graduates. He could become a journeyman and find a sort of town to practice in, or he could sort of follow the money to the United States.
And what I would love to follow up on is the fact that Gothenburg in the 1880s was the heart of the Swedish craft revival movement. We don't know quite how long he was in Gothenburg, whether he was just passing through, but that's Gustav Larsson who brought this sort of Sweden's version of the arts and crafts movement, kind of the Sloyd movement. Gustav Larsson brought that from Gothenburg to Boston in 1880. There's craft theorists who are working in sort of restored estates outside of Gothenburg. So he was there in the heart of it. So part of me wonders whether that would have given, you know, any degree of influence to what he was doing later on in his retirement when he's writing this manuscript, which really gets into the idea of woodworking as a craft ethos, not just an economic pursuit. But yeah, I'm just not sure.
Boston's a big city, but it's also a small town. So it seems to me that he was very enmeshed in the Swedish community in Boston and would have known through professional affiliation or through just, you know, day-to-day life, what was going on in the arts and crafts world.
Yeah, especially within an ethnic community too. I
Right.
mean, yeah, they're there. Larsson School was blocks away from where Althin was working.
We have one typed question in chat. Do you happen to know the village in South Sweden where he was born?
Nobelov, yeah, which my Swedish pronunciation, despite my classes.
You answer that.
And yeah, and
See, my specialty was in Yiddish craftspeople.
BBELOV, yeah.
Karen Temple had a question.
I do. This has intrigued me because my grandfather, Susan's, Johann Sjöström, had a cabinet making business at 10th and Diamond here in Philadelphia. Now, the only thing we had in our home was a school desk. He made a lot of desks for schools. Now, is this American? Probably, not Swedish. I mean, you know, but I'm going to research it.
Yeah,
This has gotten me thinking.
Neat.
Because we have a picture of him standing or sitting in front of his carriage, the horse and carriage, John D. Sjöström, cabinet maker. You might like to.
Yeah.
Yeah, the thing we like to say is that his career wasn't necessarily remarkable in that there were other immigrants doing the same thing. What is remarkable is the survival. I think about the Domini shop at Winterthur all the time for the same reasons. They were workaday craftspeople making a living, but the survival of their tools and the shop and the designs and the furniture,
Archives, the
the
photographs.
complete thing is what makes it really special.
And even just this evening, I've seen a lot of photographs of people bringing me their antiques that, you know, their grandparents made. 1888, Karin brought me one. So I think the show is a little bit of a call to arms to assess what you have in your collection, whether you're a museum, an institution, a family. You might have something that has a really important, a really interesting story attached to it.
And we also, growing up, had a workbench that didn't look too much different from that.
There you go,
really?
there you go. Yep.
All those things.
Those things are hard to move.
I'm gonna look into it.
All right, we have another online question.
Another online question. Do you know much about the Swedish community in Boston? Was it a large community? And do you know why he chose Boston?
I think
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
For that very reason, if you were to look at the demographics around 1880, Swedish were one of the highest, were one of the largest immigrant groups in Massachusetts comparatively. And so it would have made a lot of sense for the Scandinavian community in Boston would make for a very welcoming community. Also a very competitive community because, and let me get the wording of this correct, of all the immigrant groups in Massachusetts, a larger percentage of Swedish immigrants were artisans than any other immigrant group, which means he came to Boston and it was chock full of talented Swedish cabinet makers. So there was a lot of competition. He really ended up landing on his feet. He had no relatives here, but there was certainly a sizable Swedish immigrant community here.
And you think of the why, and I think it's this exclusive market that in the late 19th century, Boston is really giving rise to in terms of, you know, the colonial revival and buying these custom-made antique pieces of furniture, whether it's furnishing a room or having a reproduction created to finish an antique set that you might have descended through your old Bostonian family or something like that. I mean, the demand was here, not so much here, not Philadelphia, here in Boston, much more than you know, Newark or Philadelphia. I mentioned Jamestown, and you know, folks were moving out west a little bit too. a lot of it actually. But in terms of the East Coast, yeah, Boston was really the place to be when you were Swedish in the late
Right.
19th century.
And it's not just the Swedes. I mean, he comes sort of at the
Mhm.
end of this great Swedish
Mhm.
migration. I think 1880 is sort of the end of that first wave of immigration that brought English, Irish, Scandinavian craftspeople to Boston. The second wave that would happen from 1880 to 1920, the years that he's active, brings a whole new slew of Eastern and Southern European immigrants. And so Israel Sack gets his start in Boston, and I think about 1904. Isaac Kaplan, another cabinet maker doing the same thing, comes to Boston in the 1890s. So the periodization is really neat because he comes in at just the right point to seize this opportunity that's about to really blow up, this colonial revival movement.
Mhm.
And you'll see other immigrants follow after him, also sort of pivot from furniture manufacturing in the general sense to a more specialized trade in antique reproduction and repair and dealing.
I think we had a question over here.
I have a bit of a forward-thinking question. I'm interested in if you can comment on the current state of the current craftsmen in the furniture making business, these small craftsmen. What's going on currently in that sector, and how has the philosophies of Olaf been brought forward to current?
I don't think past 1920. So, I'm just kidding.
I mean, I can only.
That's when history ends for me.
Yeah, I mean, I would want to say that people have always tied together sort of the practice and the theory of it. It's in Althin's case, they were often separate, but we see in his manuscript that he penned in 1913 that they were coming together towards the end of his life. I would imagine, again, I don't really think past 1800 generally, so I myself am not sure, but I mean, I think we see in craft groups today that there is an ethos around like what you're consuming, you know,
It's
part
about
of the
sustainability.
Part of the movement that Althin is working parallel to is this what's called slöjd, which just is a Swedish word for, you know, generally sort of craft. That is really bouncing back, and well, it really never left, but it's this popular idea that what you make by your own hands has value for you. It's sort of this ethos of sort of like home production, valuing something because you made it, and therefore it's not something that, you know, you discard or anything like that. So I think that ethos of really, you know, sustainability, I think, yeah.
Yeah, I think the, you know, pandemic, if it brought anything into sharp relief, it's, you know, that making things by hand, whether it's baking bread or making something in your wood shop, it has its own great value to you that's distinct from capitalism. And I think I hope that this sort of current moment ushers in a new craft revival, that people are looking at the furniture they have and maybe are inspired to either upcycle or DIY or get into learning some of these traditional woodworking methods.
No one asked about IKEA tonight, so that's good.
I know. I don't know if we're allowed to talk about it here.
Christina has got.
Trevor or
Oh,
Yes.
Go ahead, Sandra.
what did they I'm sorry. What did he charge for example, for his low boy?
You probably.
Let's see, from what the conversion math that I've done, which is not very great. You know, at the low end, anything could cost in today's estimate $200-300 for maybe like a chair, something like that. For a high boy, it would be well over $2,000, you know, more than that. I mean, it depends on the hours you're putting in. He's calculating his cost by the amount of labor that would go into a piece. So if you're working something over 150, 200 hours, it's going to be in the thousands. And that goes back to the sense that he's able to sustain his business because people are willing to pay a premium for handcrafted design. He's not necessarily facing competition from the larger furniture firms in Boston because there's this really balanced distribution of businesses, and every business had a place in Boston the way that it was organized.
In some situations,
Something like that went to auction today, what would they get? You know, mostly brown furniture, antiques are not getting that much money. But would his bring a lot of money?
I don't know how much it made at auction.
Yeah, I can't remember either. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that's part of the, I don't know about irony, but part of our show is people might look at these things and not necessarily think that they're antiques because they're only, 80, 100,
Or 100.
120 years old.
Not
But
really.
when many people think of antiques,
Over.
they think further, colonial, earlier on. But I think our show is arguing for interpreting these as historic objects, whereas that might not necessarily be the case, especially if a family is owning these things and actively using them, sitting on them, perhaps writing at them.
They're technically antiques.
Okay,
They
yeah.
are over 100 years
Yeah.
old. So it really does bring in those questions into relief, what makes an antique.
Yeah.
What is the time frame of the colonial revival?
Oh boy,
That's
like what I
a difficult
tried
question,
to
yeah.
answer my dissertation.
Yeah.
I was asked that question the other day. I was doing a Newport restoration. They said, "Can you define it?" And my partner and I were like, "No." The colonial revival begins as soon as the colonial period ends. As early as 1791, I believe, is when Mass Historical Society is founded. So they are thinking about what do we do? We have all these records that are in private government offices or in private hands. They are not accessible to the public. How do we build a collection that can be publicly accessible? Now, of course, who's the public they're trying to access here? Learned white gentlemen. So the sort of classical scholarly periodization. Obviously, the colonial revival is happening in the antebellum era, but after the Civil War, there are combined forces of urbanization, industrialization, immigration, really creates the environment for a small but exclusive group of men and women who are themselves, many of them descended from New England's earliest colonists, to sort of begin reinvesting in their heritage. 1875, the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition is sort of where the sort of popular interest in colonial stuff arises because they display all of Washington's ephemera and effects there. They also have a beautiful recreation of a New England cabin. So, popularly we put it starting in 1875, and it will go straight through the mid-20th century. My dissertation ended in 1945, but that was just because I had to stop writing at some point. But it continues. As long as there is an interest in the colonial period, there will be a colonial revival. And that revival takes all sorts of forms, whether it's tourism, whether it's design, whether it's...
So is it up and down? I mean...
Yeah. Yeah, it comes and goes. But the interesting thing is that what starts as this very elite preoccupation with the domestic furnishings of the elite colonial class trickles down to the middle class, so that by 1950 you walk into any middle class home in America, you will find it in the colonial revival style. So it becomes ubiquitous.
We have nothing to add.
Chris has a question.
Did you find in, I don't know, your research, whether or not periodicals were being imported into Sweden or any of those countries where people were coming over, and perhaps if those periodicals were talking about colonial revival and or Boston as a center for that, and maybe they were reading these and seeing Boston is it, and that's where I should go.
So whether periodicals from North America were being circulated into Sweden?
That's a you question.
I can honestly say I'm not sure. Yeah, I just don't know. I mean, let me think. The Sweden's version of the arts and crafts movement starts more or less, indigenously in a sense. I mean, it really actually was founded in Finland and parts of Russia and moved into Sweden from there. So that's that side of the movement. I'm not really sure whether sort of American colonial revival was moving into Sweden in the late 19th century. Yeah.
But like, take for example, the Jews, which I'm, writing about all the time. kinship-based occupational networks meant that you went where your uncle, your brother, your cousins were going, and there was always a job guaranteed for you there. That happened in the furniture trade, and it happened in the garment trade, for example. And I think similarly with Swedes, you know, if all the young men are leaving the country and going to America, they're probably all going to the same place. They're figuring it out. What's going to work for me is going to work for my friends and my cousin and my uncle. So I think it just ends up being demographically that everyone's going to want to settle where their fellow ethnic kin is.
It's a lot of the story of immigration. And Althin was the first in his family to move to Boston. So whether it was through more of a friendship network or word of mouth, yeah, I'm not sure.
There was also recruitment literature I've seen for other towns, not Boston specifically, but where their marketing come to Swedes, come to our town, this is a good place to settle. So there probably was that for Boston as well. I can't help but imagine. And from everything I can tell, Swedes ever since, well, throughout America's history have been really interested in what's going on in this country. And so there's always been a pull factor here.
Yeah, but Boston did offer the best economic conditions for a trained Swedish artisan. Like I said, that balanced distribution of businesses, the ability to accumulate capital quickly and start your own business. If you were entrepreneurial, Boston was a really good place to be as opposed to other cities at that time.
Yeah. And again, there were more of these Swedish artisans because of Sweden's late industrialization and sort of this, again, later decline of the guild system. So more of that traditional training was lasting well into the end of the 19th century.
It was less about the push factors that are pushing people out of Sweden and more about the pull factors that are pulling people to Boston, as my immigration professor would say.
Do we have one last question?
You said that he was very interested in carving also. Did he have contact with other people in Boston at the turn of the century, like, for example, Charles Prendergast, who then went more into the artistic, decorative?
Well, he gets his start, the furniture shop that he starts working at, they specialize in both furniture and mantles, wooden mantles, architectural fixtures. So he finds this community of Swedish artisans. We're all kind of doing the same thing. And he maintains professional ties with them. So for example, if he needs help with marquetry or he needs an additional carver for a piece, he will contact very likely another Scandinavian artisan to do that work with him or for him.
I think for me, one of the most interesting things about Althin is the degree to which he's remaining sort of aloof from some of the carving movements, the Scandinavian carving movements, which are moving into Boston at exactly the same time that he immigrates there. I mean, there's the well-known and well-regarded Swedish carver Carl von Riedingsvard, who immigrated approximately the same time. I think he was born 2 years after Althin, but he moved to Boston and founded a school for ladies to learn wood carving, and women and children, really delving into the educational and sort of the socially uplifting aspects of carving as sort of a manual practice. And I mentioned Gustav Larsson already. I mean, his school for carving was operating a few blocks away from Althin, but never in all of the quarterly issues of the Sloyd Review, which Larsson is publishing, do you see Althin mentioned as a subscriber or as a, any sort of contributor. So it seems like he's really remaining separate from this ideal-driven craft movement because he's a businessman, and because he, at the end of the day, is running a shop to make money. And we do see in his manuscript that he's still thinking about craft, and he's still thinking about bridging the gap between craft and making, but he's not quite during his career willing to, I think fully embrace these largely ideal driven craft movements.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much, Erica and Trevor.